The faint whisper of arrows slicing through the air filled the Lexington Archery Club that morning. Feathered fletchings trembled against taut bowstrings. Targets, lined up like sentinels at the far end of the hall, bore the battered wounds of countless practice sessions. Among the rows of athletes, dressed in branded gear and shining new accessories, stood a woman no one noticed, or rather chose not to notice. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't belong, if you've ever been quietly told you weren't enough, then you'll want to stay for what happened next, because this wasn't just a competition. It became a lesson no one at Lexington would ever forget. Lee Dawson adjusted the strap of her old canvas satchel and stepped through the wide glass doors. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, drawing no greetings, no welcome, only a few side glances. At 36, Lee didn't fit the club's profile. She wasn't a teen prodigy, fresh from academy lessons. She wasn't a retired Olympian coasting on former glories. She wasn't sponsored, wasn't connected, wasn't anyone. Just a simple woman in worn jeans and a faded jacket, carrying an equally faded recurve bow wrapped carefully in cloth. She moved to the registration table, where a young volunteer, clipboard in hand, headset on, barely looked up. "Practice lanes are reserved for members today," the girl said flatly, her eyes scanning Lee's outfit like it was a mistake. Lee pulled a laminated pass from her satchel, a gift, courtesy of a raffle she barely remembered entering. "Day pass," she said softly. The volunteer hesitated, then waved a hand toward the farthest lane, lane 14, a beat-up corner lane most members avoided. Lee nodded politely and moved on. She didn't mind. She wasn't here for them. She was here for herself. Across the hall, Caleb Monroe adjusted the sight on his compound bow with mechanical precision. At 28, Caleb was already a legend in the regional archery circuit, four-time state champion, two-time national silver medalist, and self-proclaimed face of Lexington Club. He wore it all proudly, the monogram jacket, the sponsorship patches stitched along his sleeves, the whispers of admiration trailing him like perfume, and he saw Lee. From across the hall, he noticed her the moment she entered, but not as a threat, as amusement. He nudged his friend Aaron, who was fine-tuning his own equipment. "Look at that," Caleb said under his breath, smirking. "Walmart warrior reporting for duty." Aaron chuckled cruelly. "Bet she thinks Hunger Games trained her." They laughed, low enough to seem casual, loud enough to be cruel. Another club member, Kristen, joined in. "Maybe she's here for a refund on that antique." Their voices carried just enough. Lee heard them. She said nothing, because Lee had been ignored before. And what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that she wasn't here to seek approval. She was here to make good on a promise. One arrow at a time. Lane 14 wasn't much, a cracked mat, a target frayed around the edges. The lighting flickered every few minutes. But Lee set up her bow with reverence. She moved slowly, wrapping her fingers around the grip with the same quiet care a musician gives an old violin. Her bow was nothing special. Wooden riser, fiberglass limbs, a few scratches earned through years of use. But in the right hands, it was deadly, and Lee's hands were not new to this world. Her father had placed a bow in her hands when she was 7 years old, not because he dreamed of medals, not because he wanted trophies. Because where they lived, in a weathered cabin tucked between pine forests in Vermont, the bow wasn't sport, it was survival, it was discipline, it was peace. "You don't fight the bow," her father had told her one summer evening, guiding her elbow with calloused fingers. "You become part of it. Breath, focus, release. That's all it is." He taught her to read the wind by the tremble of leaves, to feel distance in her bones without needing a rangefinder. By the time she was 15, Lee could split a pine cone at 50 yards. But life, like wind, changes without warning. When her father died suddenly from a logging accident, Lee packed away the bow, and with it, the part of herself that once soared. Until now. Until the letter in her mailbox, a raffle ticket she had entered on a whim at the county fair 6 months earlier. "Congratulations. You've won a day pass to the prestigious Lexington Archery Club." Lee almost threw it away. But something inside her, something buried under years of quiet grief, stirred awake, not to chase glory, not to impress strangers, but maybe, just maybe, to feel that tether to her father again. One breath, one shot, one promise. Lee adjusted her stance, left foot slightly forward. Shoulders loose, string hand relaxed. Around her, the chatter of the club grew louder, whispers, smirks, someone even snickered. She ignored it all. She knocked the arrow, exhaled slowly, and lifted the bow. Her focus narrowed, not to the battered target but to the center of the center. The heartbeat of the mark, the space between breaths. She inhaled once, held it halfway, and released. The arrow snapped forward with a clean, unforced energy, a sigh of flight rather than a scream. It crossed the hall in less than a second, thwack. The arrow struck the target dead center, punching into the bullseye with surgical precision. The paper curled slightly around the shaft, perfectly symmetrical. For a moment, no one reacted. It was as if the entire room had inhaled collectively and forgotten how to exhale. Caleb, adjusting his scope, turned lazily toward the sound. When he saw where Lee's arrow landed, his smile faltered. Aaron stopped mid-laugh. Kristen lowered her phone, her latest Instagram post forgotten. Slowly, the whispers changed, shifted, not jokes, not insults, questions. Curiosity and something else, recognition. But Lee wasn't looking at them. She didn't even glance. She simply knocked another arrow, repeating the movement like a prayer. One breath, one shot, thwack. Another bullseye, this time even tighter, splitting the fibers already torn by the first. Caleb's jaw clenched imperceptibly. Across the hall, the senior coach, Mr. Delaney, a man who rarely paid attention to anything but his own students, lowered his clipboard and stepped closer, squinting at lane 14. Lee continued, arrow after arrow, 10 in total, each one slicing into the exact same center point, layering impact over impact until the target's bullseye was barely recognizable. It wasn't just accuracy, it was annihilation, total, effortless, surgical domination. When she finally lowered her bow and set it down, the room was silent. The woman they had mocked wasn't just good. She was better than anything they'd seen that day, maybe better than anything they'd seen all season. And Caleb Monroe, state champion, national silver medalist, self-proclaimed king of the Lexington Archery Club, felt the first real knot of fear tighten in his chest. At the far end of the room, Mr. Delaney broke the silence. He cleared his throat and called out, loud enough for all to hear, "Miss Dawson, would you be willing to stay for today's Champions Challenge?" All heads turned. Caleb's face turned a shade paler. Lee, calm as a forest at dusk, simply nodded once. "Of course," she said. And just like that, the woman they ignored became the woman they couldn't look away from. The tension inside Lexington Archery Club had thickened like humid air before a storm. Bows hung half-forgotten in limp hands. Conversations dwindled into whispers. Every pair of eyes locked on lane 14, on the woman they had dismissed hours earlier, now standing calmly at the center of it all. Lee Dawson wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't checking her phone, adjusting her sleeves, or seeking approval. She stood still, bow cradled casually in her hand, as if she belonged there all along. And somewhere deep inside the crowd, Caleb Monroe's world began to tilt, because champions didn't fear the unranked. They didn't flinch at nobodies. And yet, his stomach twisted with something cold and unfamiliar. Mr. Delaney approached Lee, clipboard in hand, his sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. "You understand what the Champions Challenge entails, Miss Dawson?" he asked, voice neutral but respectful. Lee nodded once. "I do." He gave a rare, approving smile. "The reigning champion," he glanced over his shoulder at Caleb, who straightened reflexively, "is granted 3 shots at 3 distances, 50, 70, and 90 meters. You'll match him shot for shot. Best cumulative score wins." Lee simply adjusted the bowstring tension slightly, checking it more out of habit than necessity. "And the equipment?" she asked. "Club standard issue," Delaney confirmed. "To level the field." Another ripple went through the crowd. It wasn't just her old bow then, it was her hands. Her focus, her stillness. Caleb's smile, so easy earlier, was now a tight grimace. At the equipment table, Caleb selected a gleaming composite recurve from the club's premium stock. He handled it confidently, adjusting the sight with quick, practiced movements. Lee approached the table more slowly, scanning the options without emotion. She chose a simple bow, no fancy mods, no specialty grips, just a tool, because in her hands it wasn't the bow that mattered, it was the archer. The range officer, a young man with a clipboard and wide, nervous eyes, called them to the shooting line. The target stood in the distance, bright against the afternoon sun filtering through the range's glass walls. 3 distances, 3 arrows. Caleb rolled his shoulders, loosening his arms with exaggerated movements. A show, for the crowd, for himself. Lee simply set her stance balanced, grounded, silent. She didn't need to perform, she needed only to breathe. First distance, 50 meters. Caleb stepped forward, pulling the bowstring back in a smooth motion. The muscles in his arms flexed dramatically, earning an appreciative murmur from a few loyal fans near the back. He loosed the arrow, thwip. It struck the target just off-center. A solid gold zone shot, but not dead center. He smiled tightly and stepped aside. Lee stepped to the line without hesitation. No fanfare. No deep breath meant for theatrics, just quiet control. She raised the bow, pulled and released. Thwip. Her arrow landed dead center, splitting the very heart of the gold circle. The crowd shifted, some leaning forward instinctively. First round, Lee Dawson perfect. Caleb Monroe good but not flawless. Second distance, 70 meters. The gap stretched wider now, harder to maintain form, harder to adjust for the slight breeze whispering through the open range doors. Caleb adjusted his stance, sighted carefully and released. The arrow veered slightly right, landing inside the gold but near its edge. His jaw tightened imperceptibly. Lee approached the line again, no changes, no hesitation. Her father's voice floated through her memory. When it's hardest to breathe, breathe deeper. She sighted, exhaled halfway and released. Thwip. The arrow buried itself next to the first, another perfect center. The whispering among the crowd grew louder now, edging into disbelief. Caleb's supporters started falling silent. Final distance, 90 meters. A distance designed to expose weakness. A test of breath control, mental endurance, and pure focus. Caleb wiped his palms against his pants. He pulled back, steadied, fired. This time the arrow dipped slightly low, still on target, but barely clinging to the gold zone. A visible mistake. The kind you couldn't explain away. The kind judges noticed. The kind sponsors noticed. And the kind Caleb Monroe had built a career pretending he didn't make. Lee stepped forward. The world seemed to pull away from her, the edges blurring into meaningless noise. There was only her breath, her heartbeat, the line between her fingers and the horizon. She drew back the bowstring, feeling the familiar strain in her shoulders, the stretch of memory, the echo of her father's lessons. And she fired, thwip. The arrow sailed across the 90 meters, a clean arc through the heavy air, dead center. Again, 3 arrows, 3 perfect shots. 3 undeniable truths. The range officer cleared his throat, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. Final scores: Lee Dawson 30, Caleb Monroe 26. A beat. And then, slowly, awkwardly, the applause started, not from Caleb's friends, not from the loyalists, from the others. From those who recognized something they couldn't deny, no matter how much they wanted to: excellence, quiet, patient, and absolute. Caleb stiffened, hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to argue, to demand a rematch. To claim a faulty bow, a gust of wind, sabotage, anything but the truth staring him down. But no words came, because deep down even he knew today wasn't stolen from him. It was earned by her, arrow by arrow, breath by breath, choice by choice. Mr. Delaney approached Lee, his lined face unreadable. He extended a hand. "Congratulations, Miss Dawson," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "You are the new champion of Lexington Archery Club." Lee shook his hand firmly but without arrogance. It wasn't about the title. It wasn't about the applause. It was about a promise kept, a tether restored, and the quiet, unwavering truth that no one could take from her now. Later, as the hall began to empty, Caleb lingered near the equipment table, his bow dangling forgotten in one hand. Aaron approached, expression twisted in confusion. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered. Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down he understood. They hadn't just lost a match. They had lost to something they didn't even have the words to describe. Something steady. Something unbreakable. Something real. At lane 14, Lee packed her things with methodical care. Her satchel slung over her shoulder, she paused for a moment, gazing down the now empty range. In her mind, she could almost see her father standing at the far target, arms crossed, smiling that quiet smile that always said, "See, I told you. All you had to do was trust yourself." Lee smiled back, a small, private smile, and walked out of Lexington Archery Club, leaving behind whispers, broken egos, and the shattered remains of every limit they had ever placed on her. Well, before we continue, if you're enjoying this story and love such dramas, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber keeps me motivated to dig deeper, uncover more wild stories, and bring you even crazier content. Your support means everything. It's what keeps this channel going strong. And trust me, there's plenty more chaos coming your way. Back to the story. Whispers have a strange way of growing when pride is wounded. By the next morning, the story of Lee Dawson's quiet destruction of Lexington's golden boy had spread far beyond the club's walls. It wasn't just the members talking now. It was coaches at other clubs. It was local sports blogs. It was sponsors sniffing the air, sensing the shift. Someone new had entered the field, someone they hadn't prepared for, someone they couldn't control. And for Caleb Monroe, the aftermath was worse than the loss itself, because losing on the shooting line could be spun, explained away. But losing the crowd, that kind of loss was permanent. Inside the Lexington Club's boardroom, Caleb sat slumped at the far end of the conference table, jaw tight, arms crossed. Mr. Delaney sat at the head of the table, reviewing paperwork with slow, deliberate movements. Other club officials milled about, quiet, nervous energy filling the room. "You're overreacting," Caleb muttered finally. Mr. Delaney didn't look up. "Am I?" Caleb pushed forward, his voice gaining strength. "I had an off day. That woman Dawson, she got lucky. Anyone can get lucky once." Mr. Delaney closed the folder carefully and folded his hands atop it. "3 perfect shots at 3 professional distances isn't luck," he said calmly. "It's mastery." Caleb's face flushed hot. "She's nobody. She hasn't competed nationally. She doesn't have rankings." She has skill," Mr. Delaney interrupted sharply, voice cutting across the room like a blade. "And after yesterday, she has our respect." A silence fell so heavy it pinned Caleb to his seat. Respect, a word he once thought was his by right, now being handed to a woman in old jeans and a cloth-wrapped bow. Outside the boardroom, Lee moved through the practice range with quiet purpose. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't parading. She was training, the way she had for years when no one was watching, when no one cared. At Lane 7, a few newer members whispered as she passed young shooters whose wide eyes shone with something different than fear, admiration. At Lane 10, an older member, a man who once laughed behind her back, gave a small, respectful nod. Lee returned it with a slight smile. Change doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it walks in quietly, uninvited, and rewrites everything. Later that afternoon, as Lee wiped down her bowstring and prepared to leave, Kristen, one of Caleb's closest allies, approached. The sharp click of her expensive boots echoed across the hall. "Hey," Kristen said, forcing a brittle smile. "Congrats on your little win." Lee paused, looking up slowly. Kristen shifted, clearly uncomfortable under Lee's steady gaze. "It's just," Kristen rushed ahead, voice falsely light. "People are saying you had an advantage." Lee blinked once. "Advantage?" Kristen shrugged, lips twisting. "Old equipment, less weight, less resistance. It's easier, right?" Lee set her bow down carefully. "No," she said simply. Kristen pressed on, a little desperate now. "I mean, it's not fair if you're not using competition standard gear." Lee tilted her head slightly, studying her. "I used the same club bow Caleb used during the challenge," she said, voice calm. "The scores are posted. You're welcome to review them." Kristen flushed. "I'm just saying," she snapped. "Some of us work years to get here. You walk in off the street and what?" Lee asked softly. Kristen faltered. Beneath the glittering jacket, beneath the practiced smirk, the truth leaked out: fear. Not of Lee, but of what Lee represented. A world where skill mattered more than reputation, where quiet excellence crushed arrogance, where the rules, unspoken, unwritten, no longer protected the privileged. Kristen spun on her heel and walked away, heels clacking faster now. Lee watched her go, then returned to packing her bag. No need to argue, no need to defend. Her arrows had spoken, and the truth didn't need a louder voice. That evening, Lee drove out of the city and into the low hills beyond. She needed air, space, silence. She pulled off onto a dirt road, parking near an abandoned field surrounded by dense woods. She set up a portable target in the clearing, her breath steaming in the cool air. No judges, no scores, just her, the bow, and the line between who she had been and who she was becoming. She shot for hours, tuning herself, listening to the soft whump of the string, the whisper of the arrow. And as the stars bled into the night sky, Lee felt something old and powerful settle inside her. Not pride, not revenge, peace. But peace rarely lasts when jealousy festers. Across town, Caleb sat hunched over his laptop, glaring at social media posts he couldn't control. Clips of Lee's perfect shots, slow-motion replays of the arrow splitting the bullseye, articles praising the simple woman who rewrote the rules, and beneath it all, comments, thousands of them. Skill over ego, every time. Finally someone who doesn't need to brag to win. Dawson is the real deal. Respect. Caleb slammed the laptop shut with a curse. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't the story he wanted told. And if Lee Dawson thought she could walk into his kingdom and take his crown without consequence, she had another thing coming. The next morning, Lee arrived at the range to find a notice taped to lane 14. Notice: pending eligibility review. Temporary suspension from advanced challenges. Her heart tightened, then steadied. This wasn't unexpected. Power doesn't give up its throne without a fight. Behind her she heard footsteps. Caleb stood there, arms crossed, smile cold. "Club has standards," he said casually. "You understand?" Lee turned to face him fully. "Yes," she said, "I do." Caleb stepped closer, voice dropping to a sneer. "You had your moment, enjoy it because it's over." Lee studied him for a long moment, this man who had once thought himself untouchable. Then she smiled, not cruelly, not mockingly, just a small, steady smile. "Moments pass," she said, "but truth stays." Without another word, she lifted her bow and walked to a different lane, a new one they hadn't assigned her, because Lee Dawson didn't need permission to aim true, and she didn't need their approval to win. The first rule of survival her father had taught her was simple. You don't argue with storms. You outlast them. Lee Dawson stood at the far end of the Lexington Archery Club, on a lane no one offered her, using a bow no one tuned for her, firing at targets no one cheered for her to hit. And yet, arrow after arrow, shot after shot, she didn't miss, she didn't waver, because storms pass and Lee stayed. At first the officials pretended not to notice. At first the others tried to laugh it off, just a fluke, just beginner's luck. But day after day, Lee's arrows carved the truth into the walls of that club, a truth no rumor could erase. She wasn't lucky, she wasn't accidental, she was skilled, dangerously, indisputably skilled, and the storm Caleb Monroe had hoped would bury her. It was starting to drown him instead. By the end of the week, the whispers had changed again. No longer derision, no longer suspicion. Now admiration, respect, even awe. Students who once barely acknowledged Lee now found excuses to pass by her lane, stealing glances at her form. Even a few seasoned competitors, men and women who had once scoffed, began adjusting their own stances after watching her, trying to mimic her breathing, her release, her unshakable calm. But you can't copy what's lived through the marrow of a person. You can only learn by watching. And what they saw in Lee was something no sponsorship, no amount of privilege, no inherited advantage could fake. Mastery, quiet, earned, real. One morning, Mr. Delaney called a private meeting with Lee in his office. The room was modest, worn leather chairs, old wooden desk, the faint smell of polished oak. He gestured for her to sit. She did, setting her bow carefully against the chair beside her. Delaney leaned forward, hands steepled. "Miss Dawson," he began, "I owe you an apology." Lee said nothing. She didn't need to, he continued. The eligibility review, it was politically motivated, not performance-based. In other words, Caleb's influence. Lee nodded once, encouraging him to continue. Delaney exhaled. "The board has reviewed footage, scores, witness accounts. There is no question of your capability. You are fully reinstated, effective immediately." He paused, studying her. "You also have an invitation." Lee raised an eyebrow slightly. "Invitation?" Delaney slid a crisp white envelope across the desk. "The Lexington Open. The biggest regional competition before nationals, prestigious, televised, career-making, and until now off-limits to outsiders like her. You don't have to accept," Delaney said, "but I think you belong there." Lee picked up the envelope. It was heavier than she expected. Or maybe it was the weight of what it represented. A door, once bolted shut, swinging open, not because someone handed her a key, but because she kicked it down, one arrow at a time. She met Delaney's eyes. "I'll compete," she said simply. When the announcement hit the Lexington Club bulletin board, it sent ripples through every corner of the range. Lee Dawson, the simple woman, the outsider, the nobody, would be competing against the region's best, against Caleb Monroe, again. And this time there would be cameras, judges, sponsors, and an audience far larger than Lexington's polished marble floors could contain. The day of the Lexington Open arrived wrapped in thick spring air and nervous energy. Competitors lined up in crisp uniforms. Bows gleamed under fluorescent lights. Judges in dark blazers conferred at the scoring tables. In the stands, a crowd buzzed, local fans, family members, curious outsiders drawn by the story already crackling through social media. The woman who split the champion's bullseye. Lee stood at the edge of the prep area, adjusting her bow. She wore no flashy gear, no sponsorship stitched into her sleeves, just simple black jeans, a gray t-shirt and a worn leather quiver, the same one her father had gifted her for her 16th birthday. Caleb paced several lanes down, jaw tight, motion sharp. Aaron, his right-hand man, leaned in close. "You can crush her," he muttered. "She's not built for this pressure." Caleb didn't answer, because deep down he wasn't so sure anymore. The competition was structured simply: 3 rounds, 3 distances, 50, 70, 90 meters. Cumulative score decided the victor. The first round began with a sharp blast of the starting whistle. Competitors took their places. Caleb's first shot was strong, tight grouping, just brushing the bullseye. A wave of polite applause from his fans rippled through the stands. Lee approached her lane, steadied herself, not for them, not for Caleb, but for the promise she made long ago, a promise whispered into the woods where her father's spirit still walked. Breath, focus, release. She drew the string back and fired. Thwack, bullseye, not brushing, dead center. The applause was louder this time, not polite, real. From strangers who didn't even know her name 2 weeks ago. From people who simply recognized truth when they saw it. Round after round, arrow after arrow, Lee stayed steady. She didn't rush. She didn't force. She simply shot, breath after breath, shot after shot, weaving a tapestry of focus and precision across the open air. Caleb grew tighter, harsher. His shots grew wilder. He cursed under his breath after a misaligned shot at 70 meters. Aaron tried to hide the panic in his face. Because it was happening again. The thing they thought they had controlled, the narrative they thought they owned, slipping away, again, at the hands of the woman they had mocked, dismissed, ignored. When the final round ended and the judges tallied the scores, Lee stood off to the side, adjusting the tension of her bowstring absently. She didn't need the scoreboard to know. She could feel it, the same way a storm feels the break of light through heavy clouds. The announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. First place, Lee Dawson. A beat, a roar of applause, real, thundering, undeniable. Caleb didn't stay for the photographs. He didn't shake her hand. He disappeared into the crowd, leaving only the echo of his ambition crumbling behind him. After the ceremony, as Lee packed her gear, a small girl approached, maybe 10 years old, dragging a pink plastic recurve bow behind her. She looked up wide-eyed. "Miss Dawson," she said shyly. Lee knelt down. Yes, the girl's hands twisted nervously in her hoodie sleeves. I'm not very good yet, but I want to be like you." Lee smiled, a soft, honest smile. "You already are," she said. "How?" the girl whispered. Lee tapped the girl's chest gently over her heart. "Because you believe you can." The girl beamed. And somewhere, far from the flashing cameras, far from the roaring crowds, Lee's father smiled too. Because it wasn't the winning that mattered. It was what came after. It was what grew. And Lee Dawson had planted something today that would grow far beyond anything she could have imagined. Victory has a strange way of exposing character. For those built on true strength, it humbles. For those built on ego, it destroys. And for Caleb Monroe, Lee Dawson's victory at the Lexington Open wasn't just a loss. It was a humiliation, one he couldn't accept, one he couldn't survive, not with pride intact. And so pride did what pride always does when wounded. It lashed out. 2 days after the tournament, Lee received an unexpected email from the Lexington Archery Club's disciplinary committee. Subject: urgent, allegations of equipment tampering. The email was cold, clinical. Someone had filed a formal complaint, alleging Lee's bow had been illegally modified to gain an advantage during the Open. The penalty, if proven, disqualification, suspension, public disgrace. The weapon of choice wasn't a bowstring or a target this time. It was bureaucracy. A smear campaign, a storm of doubt. Lee sat back in her kitchen chair, staring at the screen. Part of her wasn't surprised. She had seen it coming the moment she saw Caleb's back as he stalked away from the awards ceremony. Some people lose with honor, some lose with poison, and Caleb. He had chosen his path. Lee didn't panic, she didn't call anyone, she didn't rage on social media, she did what she had always done. She prepared. She stayed steady, because storms pass and truth endures. Meanwhile, inside Caleb's apartment overlooking downtown Lexington, the mood was entirely different. Aaron slumped into a chair, fidgeting nervously. "This is risky," he muttered. Caleb paced. "It's necessary," he snapped. Aaron wiped his palms on his jeans. "What if they check the gear? What if they find nothing?" Caleb stopped mid-stride. "They won't check. It'll be a cloud hanging over her, a question mark. That's all we need." Aaron didn't look convinced, neither did Caleb deep down. But pride is a terrible advisor. It tells you that lies are strategy, that sabotage is survival, that a stolen crown still shines the same. Back at the club, Lee stood quietly before the committee. Three officials in blazers sat behind a long table, expressions careful, professional. Mr. Delaney sat among them, his face unreadable. The lead official, a thin woman with sharp glasses, spoke first. "Miss Dawson, you understand the nature of these allegations." Lee nodded. "I do. And do you have a response?" Lee reached into her satchel and withdrew a slim leather folder. Inside, a meticulous logbook, dates, times, maintenance records, witness statements from certified techs who had inspected her equipment before and after the competition. Every page notarized, every adjustment documented. She laid it calmly before them. "I maintain my equipment to standard specifications," Lee said. "No modifications outside regulation, certified and verified." The official scanned the first few pages, frowning slightly. Then Mr. Delaney leaned forward. "We've also reviewed security footage," he said, voice neutral. "Specifically footage from the night before the competition." He pressed a button on a small remote, and a screen behind him flickered to life. Grainy footage from the club's security cameras appeared. In black and white, the equipment room was visible, a narrow hallway lined with lockers. And there, clear as day, Caleb Monroe, entering after hours, opening Lee's assigned locker, fiddling with the contents, looking around nervously before slipping away. A stunned silence filled the room. The official turned slowly back toward Lee. "You were right to prepare," she said quietly. An hour later, Caleb was officially suspended from the Lexington Archery Club pending a full ethics investigation. Sponsors began pulling out within the day. Local news caught wind of the story by evening. And by morning, Caleb's carefully curated image was in freefall. Lee didn't celebrate, she didn't gloat. She simply kept showing up to the range, practicing, training, because for her this was never about revenge, it was about mastery. It was about honoring the lessons stitched into her bloodline, into her muscles, into the calluses on her fingers, breath, focus, release. That weekend, as she trained at Lane 7, a familiar figure approached, Mr. Delaney. This time his posture was different, less guarded, more open. He held out an envelope. "We're inviting you," he said, "to represent the Lexington Archery Club at Nationals." Lee blinked. Nationals. The tournament her father used to talk about in quiet, wistful tones. The place where the best, truly the best, gathered to test themselves against the edge of human ability. She took the envelope carefully. "I'm honored," she said, and meant it. Delaney smiled. "For what it's worth," he added, voice low, "you've reminded this club what excellence really looks like." That night, Lee sat alone on the balcony of her small apartment. The city sprawled out below her, a tangle of lights and possibilities. She ran her fingers lightly along the worn grip of her bow. She wasn't here because someone paved a road for her. She wasn't here because someone opened a gate. She was here because when every gate was slammed shut, she found her own path through the woods. Because storms don't define survivors, endurance does. And Lee Dawson had endured. She had endured the mocking, the sabotage, the quiet doors closed behind her back. And she had answered them not with shouting, not with fury, but with 10 arrows, each a whisper of defiance that hit dead center. Across town, Caleb packed boxes in his silent apartment. The framed championship photos, once proudly displayed, now lay face down. The walls were bare. The sponsors weren't returning calls. The board had made it clear. Rehabilitation would take years, if it ever came. Pride, once the crown on his head, was now an anchor around his neck. And as he taped the final box shut, he realized something cold and final. It wasn't Lee who ruined him. It was himself, it always had been. A week later, Lee stood on a much larger field, the National Archery Championship grounds, thousands of spectators, rows upon rows of competitors, television crews bustling around. Her lane was marked simply, Dawson, L, independent entry. No sponsorship banners, no entourage, just her, and the bow that had carried her through every storm. She set her stance, knocked the first arrow, and smiled just once, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, for the girl she had been, for the woman she had become. And for the promise she would never break. Breath, focus, release. The arrow soared. The arrow flew across the open field, a silver thread sewing the past and present together. Lee Dawson exhaled slowly as the string snapped forward, her muscles relaxing into the perfect follow-through. In the stands, the crowd leaned forward. Some already recognized her. The woman who came out of nowhere. The woman who split a champion's bullseye. The woman who didn't shout her greatness but proved it, arrow by arrow. The National Archery Championship wasn't just another competition. It was the crucible, where egos cracked, where pretenders crumbled, where only the purest skill, sharpened by years of quiet sacrifice, could survive. And Lee, she didn't arrive as a dark horse anymore. She arrived as a storm, silent, inevitable. The event was brutal in its demands. 12 rounds, different distances, different wind conditions, different expectations. Some competitors cracked under the pressure, missing easy shots, rushing their releases. Others tried to impress the cameras, firing with exaggerated flair that cost them dearly. Lee ignored it all. Her world narrowed to the rhythmic cycle she trusted: breath, focus, release. Each arrow flew like a promise, each impact on the target like a quiet drumbeat of persistence. As the rounds advanced, Lee's name climbed steadily up the leaderboard: 5th, 4th, 3rd. By the final round, she was second, trailing by a mere 2 points behind the reigning national champion, Maya Sinclair. Maya Sinclair was everything the archery world expected from a champion: young, polished, media-trained, with endorsements lined up like trophies. She stood at the line before Lee, her bow gleaming with sponsor logos. She fired her final shot, a clean gold zone hit, solid, safe. The crowd applauded politely. Maya smiled for the cameras, perfect and poised, then stepped aside. Now it was Lee's turn. One shot. A perfect bullseye would win it all. A near miss would leave her second, still a stunning outcome for an unknown, but not history-making. Lee approached the line. The world held its breath, she could feel it, the weight of expectations not her own pressing against her shoulders. The cameras zoomed in, commentators whispered excitedly. The newcomer, the underdog, with a chance to topple the reigning champion. Lee ignored it all, because Lee wasn't here for them. She wasn't here for medals, or headlines, or trophies. She was here because when she was 7 years old, standing in a clearing behind a cabin in Vermont, a man with tired eyes and calloused hands taught her how to aim at the impossible and believe. "You don't fight the bow," he had said. "You become part of it." Lee smiled softly, raised the bow, drew back, and fired. The arrow soared, a clean, unhurried arc against the bright blue sky. It struck dead center, slicing through the final bullseye without mercy or apology. For a full second, the world seemed to freeze. Then the judges' flags went up. Perfect score. The stands erupted into thunderous applause, not polite, not restrained roaring, not because a celebrity won, but because something purer had won, something real. Lee lowered her bow. She didn't pump her fists. She didn't leap into the air. She just stood there quietly, taking it in. Not the cameras, not the confetti, but the simple, breathtaking satisfaction of a promise kept, a journey completed, a new one just beginning. Later, during the awards ceremony, Lee stood atop the podium. No fancy speeches, no elaborate celebrations. The announcer handed her the gold medal. She held it lightly, not as a trophy but as a reminder. Behind the crowd, she noticed a figure slipping into the stands, an older man with a limp, wearing a battered military cap. Michael Reeves, her father's old friend. A man who had once sent her a day pass to an archery club, a spark that reignited a fire she thought she'd buried forever. Michael raised 2 fingers to his temple in a casual salute. Lee smiled, a real, rare smile, and nodded back. When the cameras moved on, when the reporters swarmed other finalists, Lee found a quiet corner under the grandstand. Michael met her there, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "You made good on your promise," he said gruffly. Lee shrugged lightly. "I just shot arrows." Michael chuckled. "No," he said. "You reminded people why it matters, why the quiet ones sometimes hold the deadliest aim." He pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, an old photograph. A black and white shot of her father, young and grinning, standing beside a battered target filled with perfect center shots. Michael handed it to her without ceremony. He would have been damn proud, kid, he said, voice rough. Lee swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. She tucked the photo carefully into her satchel. Not a trophy, not a medal, a legacy. That evening, Lee returned to the small practice range behind her new apartment, a modest place overlooking a wooded field. Under the stars, with only the sound of crickets for company, she set up a single battered target. No scoreboard, no judges, just her. And the silence she trusted. She strung her bow, feeling the familiar stretch in her shoulders, the hum of tension through her arms. Then, with a slow exhale, she pulled back and fired. The arrow whispered through the air and struck true, dead center, as always, as ever, because real mastery isn't about standing in the spotlight. It's about what you do when no one's watching. It's the steady hands, the focused heart, the breath that carries you through doubt. It's the simple woman who walks into a place meant to break her and leaves it remade, arrow by arrow, breath by breath, promise kept, legacy born. And as Lee Dawson lowered her bow and looked out into the endless night, she knew she hadn't just won, she had become.